Good afternoon. The webinar will begin in approximately 1 minute. Welcome and thank you for joining our monthly webinar. This month, we will be discussing continuous testing transformation. Some key takeaways you will have after this webinar will include best practices that enable success using the Gartner Magic Quadrant leader, Tricentis Tosca, 7 critical needs for test automation using commercial tools, real-life examples to take back to your team from some of the world's largest and most successful organizations in manufacturing, banking, and retail operations, and cost savings due to going digital using quality software assurance practices. During this session, please keep your microphones on mute. Questions can be asked through the GoToWebinar menu bar located under the chat functionality. We will answer questions at the end of the presentation, but you may submit them at any point throughout the session. We encourage participation throughout the webinar. You will be asked a poll question about midway through. In addition, at the conclusion of the webinar, you will be sent a survey. We truly value the opinions and feedback of our peers in the QA and IT community. If you have a few moments, we would greatly appreciate you filling it out. This webinar is sponsored by TTC. TTC is a global consulting firm that specializes in all things testing. We believe a successful digital transformation relies on having the right people, processes, and technology in one place. As organizations shift from slow, costly, and high-risk manual testing to test automation with agile and DevOps processes, they can find testing to be a bottleneck. Our goal at TTC is to help do away with that bottleneck and assist our clients in making changes by providing modern software testing and quality engineering techniques, such as test automation and test design optimization, which will remove that bottleneck and enable your organization to make the transformation from waterfall to agile to DevOps. The research in this webinar was conducted not only by TTC, but also by Tricentis. Tricentis is a leading software provider that has been recognized year after year as a leader in the QA marketplace by Gartner, Forrester, and many more reputable organizations. Their toolset includes Qtest, Tosca, and Flood, and is used by several organizations globally to streamline their QA processes within the software development lifecycle. My name is Carla Hartman. I am a Customer Success Manager with TTC. I'll be moderating this webinar. My background is in marketing, and 3 of those years in marketing have been in software and services. I have a passion towards the world going digital and digital transformation overall. And the star of the show, Chris Rolls. He is the CEO at TTC Americas. He has spent several years as a practicing QA professional, and he is really passionate about helping organizations implement modern quality assurance solutions. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Chris to get this show started.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that introduction, Carla. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Carla, and thank you everyone else for attending today. What we're going to talk about is the 7 critical success factors for continuous testing transformation. And like Carla mentioned, TTC is a software testing consultancy and services organization, and Tricentis is a software product company with tools like Tosca for model-based test automation, Qtest for agile test management, and so on. And we've got a lot of experience implementing these and other testing tools. And what you realize when you're implementing these sorts of tools is it's not just about the tool itself. Really, the tool is a catalyst for change within an organization. It's a catalyst for your transformation. And so when I speak to clients, and many of them are going on these sorts of continuous testing transformation journeys, they really ask two different questions. The first question that I hear a lot is, how should we go about our continuous testing transformation? What should we do? And the second is, what did that company do that made them so successful? So TTC and our friends at Tricentis decided that we should look into this and we should do a research report on that. And this presentation today will be about that research report, which is also available in an ebook and as part of the handouts or on ttcwebinar.com. All right, so a little bit about this report before we get started. So we sent this report out as a survey to over 50 organizations who were undergoing or who had undergone a continuous testing transformation. And we also did personal interviews with more than 10 industry leaders who have successfully guided their own organizations through these continuous testing transformations. And what we found was there are 7 critical success factors. The first critical success factor that we found was that you need organizational support to drive these transformational initiatives. The second was that we found that you needed a defined continuous testing strategy and transformation plan. It doesn't just happen overnight, you need to plan for it. And the third, and somewhat controversially around how we named it, but that you need some kind of dedicated test automation working group, team, or committee, right? You needed some team dedicated to test automation and supporting that. We also found that you needed to have continued investment in training and learning, that you should have some sort of defined and enforced best practices, that you should have partnerships with key vendors, and the most successful organizations really knew how to leverage those key vendors. And finally, that you needed to have effective methods for measuring your success. So like I said before, today we're going to go through these 7 critical success factors in a little bit more detail. You can ask questions of myself at the end of this. But before that, I think Carla has a quick poll.
Yes, so to get started, we would like to know from the audience, in your opinion, what has an impact on successful continuous testing transformation? As Chris shared, due to some of the research, he'll go into more detail what we've found, but we also want to know if you're experiencing the same things in your organization. And it looks like everyone has agreed a defined strategy, best practices, and a transformation plan is key. So Chris will now go into more detail on these.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Carla. So let's just start out at number 1. And I think this is no surprise for anyone that you need to have the full support of your organization in order to drive a transformation such as this. But what was somewhat interesting, we talk a lot about having executive support, right? So top-down level support in order to drive transformations. But one of the things that we found that was really critical was that you also need peer support, because a lot of the day-to-day decisions aren't made by executive leaders within the organization. A lot of the day-to-day decisions on influencing if these sorts of transformations will be successful are actually driven by your peers. So successful transformations really cultivated that peer support for their initiative. So let's just go into that in a little bit more detail. So first of all, executive support. And this top-down approach really helps in terms of executives communicating a shared vision for continuous testing. I assume that most of you are in fairly large organizations, and what you'll find is that it's fairly difficult to convey a consistent strategy and vision across an organization. And so executive support really helps in that respect. The second thing that executives do, which is really helpful, is actually by facilitating collaboration across teams. And so even though we reorganize when we go through an agile transformation, there are obviously still separate teams, and you might still need to engage between those teams. And so executive support can help facilitate that collaboration. Likewise, they can remove roadblocks for progress. And one of my favorite roadblocks to talk about is, security as a bottleneck. Because when you're working in a waterfall type methodology, there's a lot of security processes and they're very rigid and it's very strictly defined. But they're not always relevant or applicable when you go through an agile transformation. And for example, one of the things that I see, when you're trying to test, you might need to have different non-personal users to do your test automation. And so oftentimes you need to convince the security team to allow an exception to their policy. And by having that executive support, it allows that to occur more easily. They also provide resources to drive transformation. So this can be people, money, tools, time, all those different resources that only an executive can allocate out to you as an individual contributor or a manager or leader within the organization. And finally, they help by aligning organizational goals and KPIs. And even though all of us try and do the best that we can within our organization, we try and act in the organization's best interests. If we have KPIs and bonuses and promotions tied to certain activities, then those are the things that we're going to focus on. So executives help to align the overarching goals with the KPIs that we're measured against. And then if we look at peer support, and I think that one of the things that I found to be really interesting was how much effort leaders put into cultivating the support of their peers. And so they would do things like having lunch and learn sessions, sharing what they've learned. They would do internal demos of what's being done, and even conduct internal pilots to prove to different areas of the organization what was possible, and sharing case studies from their successes. All of this really comes under the category of evangelism. And the key message there is that if you're driving a transformation like this, if you're the leader of that within an organization, you also need to be the key evangelist. You need to share that success throughout the whole organization and cultivate that. Moving on to number 2, and I'm glad to hear that this is one of the keys that people picked out in the poll. And this also has 2 parts. You need to have a defined continuous testing strategy, because the way you test in Agile or DevOps is different from the way you test in Waterfall. And you also need to have a transformation plan, because these sorts of things don't just happen instantaneously, they take time. And so when we talk about a continuous testing strategy, we need to understand that the way you test is different, right? So a really highly structured manual testing approach where you do a heavy requirements analysis phase, that might work in a waterfall approach. But when you're in different sprints and you're working off user stories, then it's not so much about spending a month up front defining and scripting your test cases. It's about making sure you've got a bed of automated test cases and that you do some functional testing around user stories. And then you do exploratory testing on top of that. So the continuous testing strategy is different when you're in Agile and DevOps to a more traditional test strategy when you're in Waterfall. And one of the quotes that I really liked was, if your test strategy is wrong, just having another tool in and of itself won't fix that. So it's really important when you make these transformations to align on what your testing strategy should be. And then the other point here is that you need to have a plan. And so you need to figure out, where should my early successes be? Which areas of the organization should I target first? Who do I need to have on side? How can I be successful? Because organizations don't just go from 0 to 100 overnight. That does take time. And the thing that we saw here was that the leaders who had the most success aligned their transformation with broader organizational goals. And I assume that most of us here are testers or QA specialists or from the QA industry. But QA isn't always the topmost thing on a CIO's mind. But a digital transformation, implementing DevOps or a scaled agile framework or whatever it may be, a broader initiative like that is top of mind. So if you can make sure that testing is a critical part to those larger initiatives, you're going to have a lot more success. And we found that 80% of the successful leaders align their continuous testing transformation to their broader organizational strategy and transformation goals. All right, now this one here was a little bit controversial, like I said, in terms of the name we used, but we found that 83% of organizations created some form of dedicated test automation team. And the reason why this was a little bit controversial was because some people preferred to use the term test automation center of excellence, which to a lot of people connotates a kind of older school manual testing, waterfall type approach, whereas other people tended to use terms like a community of practice or a chapter or a guild, something that tends to evoke a more agile image. And regardless of what you call it, we found that in order to have a successful continuous testing transformation, you needed some form of dedicated test automation team. Now, what was also interesting here was that we actually found that the type of team that you had, the type of dedicated test automation team that you had, changed depending on how mature you were within your transformation. And so specifically, organizations who were less mature in their continuous testing transformation tended to have a more centralized test automation team. And what I mean by that is that dedicated test automation team would do all the work for all of the different products and Scrum teams and application teams and so on. But the teams that were more mature actually had most of the work being done by the individual teams, and the dedicated test automation team was just there as more of a support mechanism. So it changed, in my terminology, from being more of a center of excellence to more of a community of practice, and the community of practice being supporting the work, helping with best practices, helping with things like infrastructure, helping guide and consult within the organization. And we discussed this at length, and there are two main hypotheses about why this is true. And so the first thing that we discussed is that if you are more mature in your continuous testing transformation, you're probably also more mature in your general agile or DevOps transformation. So it makes sense that it's more of that test automation amongst all the product teams, T-shaped testers, T-shaped developers who can do test automation. So that was one thing which I think resonates. But the other hypothesis was that also when you get started on a transformation, you want it to be more centralized and controlled. You want to make sure that the first application that, say, you do automation or you do exploratory testing or whatever it is that you're looking to do, you want to make sure that's more tightly controlled. So it's more centralized, you have more oversight over it. And then once organizationally you've become to get more effective and proficient at it, then you start to send out that work into the individual Scrum teams. And I think both of those are at play here. But the long story short of all of this is that 83% of organizations who were successful had a dedicated test automation team, and that helped the rest of the organization in order to implement it. It was seen as a priority focus for them. All right, and I think this is something that's probably obvious to most people as well, but oftentimes in the day-to-day, we forget this, which is that, you don't just become an expert overnight. You need to invest in continuous training and learning for yourself and your team. And it's really easy in the day-to-day to kind of get caught up in the latest major production issue or the requirement of a new team standing up and how to help them. But the best organizations continue to make time for their team members in order to train and upskill, because what's good today won't be enough in 2 years' time, right? We're in a continuously changing and evolving industry. So you need to make sure you invest in training for yourself and your team to keep up with that. We also found out a lot about the nature of the trainings that people were doing. And so, there's been a big shift to online learning and online training recently. And that's great because it allows people to kind of self-serve and get training as they need it. But what we found is that training in and of itself isn't sufficient. And so what companies who are successful were doing was that they would combine online trainings, and we've got an example of the Tricentis continuous testing training roadmap on the right there. They would combine those online trainings, which were hugely beneficial, but they would also combine that with immersive and practical learning, which is hands-on coaching with your actual systems, tailored to what you need to do, tailored to your individual problems, and more of that immersive coaching, mentoring type training. And so initially you do a combination of online training and immersive training, but going forward into the future, you would still regularly schedule times to have continued upskilling and training. So you might have a new knowledge sharing session within your the testing team or the testing practice or group within the organization, and you might discuss new features, new tools, new approaches, new strategies. You might get external people to come in and do a revamp, and you would also include the training that you have as part of your onboarding process, so that when you have new team members, that they become skilled up in the things that they need to know as well. And I think this is particularly important when you're in the type of organization where you do a lot of rotations. A lot of the Fortune 500 do a lot of positional rotations. So people might not necessarily be a testing expert, but they might have a lot of organizational knowledge, and they come in and you want to do some onboarding to them in your team, or for example, you're taking graduates. So I think that combination of online training, immersive learning, continued knowledge sharing and upskilling, as well as a effective onboarding process was really important for those organizations. Awesome. And now just to move on to number 5, which is a defined and enforced best practices. What we see is that enforced best practices is really important, not just from maintaining the quality of work that people do, but again, linking back to number 4, it's one of the best mentoring opportunities that people have, right? So most organizations, they start off small scale and they say, hey, we don't really need to do any defined and enforced best practices. I completely disagree. What you need to do needs to be fit for purpose, right? It doesn't need to be a huge overbearing document that people don't read. I mean, that's not lean, that's not agile. It should be a lightweight wiki, but you should have something in order to set the scene so that people understand what's expected of them. So you should build some kind of defined and enforced best practices, and the review process is really important. So typically, from a test automation perspective, we would recommend a process similar to this, a normal kind of agile development process where you have a backlog, it goes to in progress, you have some kind of more technical review, and then you have a demo or business review, and then it moves on to it's done. And that definition of done is so important in order to set and maintain that level of quality. And from a test automation perspective, one of the key things is to have a definition of done, which includes, for example, that the test cases have been executed 3 times in your distributed or grid test execution environment, right? It needs to be clear that that happens, because it's no point building test automation if it doesn't actually run and work. So having that sort of thing clearly defined is incredibly important for maintaining the level of quality, particularly as you scale these sorts of initiatives out to broader team members. All right, and now moving on to number 6, and I think that some people might look at this and say, you know, it's a little bit self-serving to have a success factor as being partnering with key vendors as we're a vendor. But I think the reality is that organizations always have vendors that they work with, right? Any large or mid-sized organization is already going to have vendors and partners. You might have your software partners, you probably have your existing services partners, and you might also bring in new services partners to assist with specific areas of your transformation. So you're going to have partners, and you want to find a way to make sure you leverage those partners and those vendors as much as possible to drive your own internal transformation. And you can use them in a bunch of different ways. Some of the ways that we talked with people about, or we were informed about, is that partners really provide an external lens to view challenges. When you're sitting in your organization day to day, it's often hard to see the forest from the trees, right? You get so consumed with what you're doing that you don't often see the bigger picture. And so that's really important there. They can take another look at things. Your partners can also share insights from similar transformation efforts. So those, they can take a look at their other clients and say what works, what didn't work, and so on. They can also provide strategy development assistance and support, right? So when you're building out your strategy from the first time, you don't want to have to make all the same mistakes that everyone else does. They can give you a little bit of a head start. They can also support critical projects with additional resources and expertise, so they can help you scale up as you need to. And they can also deliver messages and endorsements from an external and reputable source. So that's one of the things that came up a few times. Sometimes an external message helps you to drive the change that you want to within an organization, right? So one of the leaders of a government agency that we work with, he said to us that what he would do is when he was wanting to drive an initiative, he might have a fairly clear idea already, but he would get an external consultancy to come in and analyze it and come up with the strategy and approach. And that was easier to take to his senior level management to say, to his CIO in this case, to say, here's what we need to do. It's from these people who've also worked with XYZ lately and have been through this transformation. Do you approve it? And that was a really effective way to leverage your partners. And I think, aligned with this is also, software partners like Tricentis. They've got a huge amount of resources and case studies and so on that you can leverage and utilize. All right. And now moving on to the final success factor that I'm going to speak about, which is to have effective methods for measuring success. And I think every Agile or DevOps presentation needs to have a quote from someone like Peter Drucker. And so he says what gets measured gets managed. And this is really important because at the end of the day, like KPIs, what we do is influenced heavily by what we get measured on. And one of the biggest challenges when you're driving a transformation like this is to figure out what to measure and what not to measure. So I've got up here some potentially good metrics to measure, and I wouldn't say this is an exhaustive list. This is a list, and it's also really important to think very carefully about your organization, what's going to resonate, and what is needed to drive your transformation. So, we talk about things like risk coverage, test automation coverage, and stability and pass rate, how much you're executing, execution time is reduced, productivity increases, cost save versus manual testing, and also defect escape percentage. But I would also say on this, probably even more important than what you do measure is actually what you don't measure. And one of the things that I've seen again and again is that organizations, when they start off on these transformations, measure the wrong things. And so an obvious one that people measure incorrectly is the number of automated test cases. And what that creates, particularly if you haven't got a clear definition of done, is that creates a pressure and an incentive to build as many automated test cases as you can, and they might not be of a high enough quality. And a consistent story that we've heard is that executives, they're kind of in the project management mindset. They were looking at number of automated test cases that were built per week or per day because that's what was being presented, and they didn't have the insight into quality. So the testers, the QA people in the Scrum teams, they were just building more and more and more test cases, and they would get to a point where the test cases weren't actually being run or weren't being used, but they were continuing to build more and more and more because that's what the executives expected. And so they created a huge amount of technical debt. And it's usually at some point around there that the head of testing was like, oh no, this isn't working. We need to change it. And so then they had to present a different set of metrics to the executives and justify why they needed to change that. So all that is to say that you really need to make sure you're measuring the right things and you've got an effective way. The final thing about measurements, you've also got to look at how easy it is for you to pull those measurements out of whatever systems you're using. What you don't want to do is have a process which takes 2 days to prepare your metrics if you're having to do it once a week, because you're wasting 40% of someone's time to pull those metrics out. You want to have ideally an automatable way of getting those metrics, and you want to have it on some kind of easily visible dashboard or reporting structure that people can look at. Move away from anything that requires manual intervention in order to pull the metrics out. Okay, so that's all from me today. Quick thank you to everyone who's attended. A little bit about TTC up here and our success with the Tricentis toolset. You can also contact me on my email or phone, as well as download a copy of the full report at ttcwebinar.com or in the handouts. So from now, let's go over to some questions. Carla, is there any questions?
Yes, we did have a few come in, and to be mindful of everyone's time, we'll just go ahead and ask one and the rest will be answered via email. So when you talked about, I'm assuming this is, I think it was Success Factor 2, what is the learning curve time period to upskill a team into a dedicated test automation working group?
Cool. Hey, thank you for that question, Carla. So there's a couple of things there. The first part of this is it depends on which tool you're using. So one of the reasons why we like the Tricentis tool set so much is that it does decrease that learning time that you need because of its model-based approach. So I'm going to answer from that perspective. Bear in mind that the other tools and so on, you might have a longer learning curve. So I divide it into two kind of questions. One is, how long does it take me for my team members to get productive given the right level of oversight? And then how long does it take for my team members to be an expert in that tool? So typically, the quickest I've seen people come up to speed from not knowing a tool at all is 2 weeks, and then they can be building test automation and so on. Usually it takes a little bit longer depending on how much time they've got allocated and so on. So let's say 2 weeks to 2 months. To become a real expert, to really know the tool inside out, and this is setting a high bar, can be about 6 to 12 months. And I'm sure people have heard that saying before, you know, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know, right? And so there's a little bit of that going on. The people in the team, the consulting team who are truly experts, also realize that there's so much they don't know. But the reality is 2 weeks to 2 months to being productive, and then 6 to 12 months to be an expert with the Tricentis Tosca toolset.
Okay, great. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Everyone who's joined us, thank you very much. Please feel free to obtain a digital copy of the ebook from our webinar website or from the handout section of your GoToWebinar panel. We'll be sending out a short survey shortly, and we truly appreciate your feedback. Thank you, everyone, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.